Captain Midnight.
This video is brought to you by Brilliant. In February of 2021, I released a video about the Chronicles of Narnia movie franchise and its slow demise. Near the end of it, I talk about how Netflix was developing a Narnia series, which we had not heard much about. I always figured that when that show got rolling, I'd return to the world of Narnia to discuss what they were trying now. The thing is, I'm not really sure what's going on with Narnia anymore. I think especially with House of the Dragon and Rings of Power on the air, it's a little odd that we haven't heard much about what's going on in the world of Narnia, especially since the Disney and Fox films sputtered out with no real conclusion. So that's what I want to talk about this week, what's going on with the Netflix project, if we actually want it, and the huge challenges it would face.
Edmund, Lucy, one of you will have to find a safe path across the ice. Susan and I are too heavy. Hurry!
So, the Netflix deal was announced back in 2018, and on June 12, 2019, one of Netflix's official accounts said that, quote, Coco writer Matthew Aldrich will serve as the creative architect and oversee the development of all films and shows adapted from C.S. Lewis's beloved Narnia universe for Netflix. So basically, they had hired someone to serve as the Kevin Feige of Narnia, overseeing not just a single show, but an entire slate of Narnia-related projects. Now that all sounds very ambitious, so maybe it's just taking a really long time to roll out. But still, this was posted over 3 years ago now, and since then, it's almost been radio silence. No casting announcements, no word on them hiring writers for a writer's room, nothing. Way back in January 2020, author C.S. Lewis's stepson, Douglas Gresham, didn't inspire confidence when he was asked about the project and said, "Yeah, to be honest, I can't tell you very much at all. We did the deal quite some months ago, and I haven't heard a word since. I mean, I am listed as the producer, but I've heard no word on what they plan to do, or how they plan to do it, or when they plan to do it for that matter. Looking at things, I don't know whether Netflix is ready to rock and roll on this or not, but we'll find out in due course." Again, to be fair, January 2020 was a very long time ago now. Still, it's a bit strange that Netflix themselves seem to rarely ever mention the project. In fact, Netflix France on Twitter seems to be the only official arm of the company to publicly mention the project this year, way back in April. It's also apparently still listed on a Netflix producer's LinkedIn page alongside some other projects. Now, most of this info is thanks to whatsonnetflix.com, and I'll try to remember to put a link to their article in the description. But when it's all assembled together, I think this paints a picture of, at best, a project that's developing very slowly, or at worst, something stuck in development hell that won't actually happen. Now my guess is that this will end up happening in some form, because Narnia as a brand just has too much name value to pass up, especially with how IP-driven entertainment has become. So it does feel like a safe-ish bet that we'll get something eventually, and maybe even soon. But I think there's no denying that it's a little weird we've gotten basically zero updates, especially when almost everything we know about the project was announced before the pandemic. Both the film and TV landscape have changed a lot since then, not to mention Netflix themselves. So I wouldn't be surprised if what we eventually get is radically different from what was initially planned, which sounded like a really expensive slate that would have included weaving a story in and out of both film and television. I'm always skeptical when stuff like that gets announced because it doesn't have the best track record to actually materialize. There's so much stuff like the Dune TV show that was supposed to tie into the new movie, or maybe the best/worst example, the plan to tackle Stephen King's Dark Tower series in both mediums that stalled out very quickly after the first film flopped. Now I guess the jury is still out on whether the Batman's live-action Penguin show with Colin Farrell will still happen, but overall, announcing movies and TV shows that tie into each other seems to rarely work out like studios think it will. All that said, I do think there's plenty of room left for an adaptation of these novels. Yes, we already had 3 movies, one of which was even hugely successful, but it's far from a complete adaptation, and honestly, though they have their moments, I don't think they do a great job of capturing the charm of these stories, especially those last 2. In my previous Narnia video, I talked a lot about the challenges those films had in trying to take these very old, very unique children's novels and trying to reshape them into something resembling a blockbuster fantasy film. And in the end, I just don't think that works for the majority of these stories. Now, a TV series might be easier, but I think they're just very hard books to adapt for the size of audience that Netflix would want to capture. There's just a lot of obstacles here. I know many will cite the series' very overt Christian themes as one of them. Whether it's, I don't like these stories because they're too preachy, or I don't trust Netflix to maintain those themes in any adaptation. Sentiments that both make sense to me, but I do think with a balance of skillful writing that isn't too heavy-handed, paired with a healthy respect for the source material and Lewis's overall very religious vision, I think they could pull it off in a way that works for most people, even if it'll never work for everyone. The real biggest barrier in my mind will actually be getting people to commit to a show with a radically different cast and stakes every season. Now I know what you may be thinking. Well, there are seasonal anthology shows that pull this off. Look at American Horror Story, which changes casts and settings every year. But Narnia isn't an anthology at all. These are all very connected stories, they just happen to be ones where the cast gets overhauled in nearly every book. And with a TV show, that's really hard to pull off. Trying to reinvest in like Peter or Susan after several seasons of them being nowhere to be found is just going to be a really hard pill for audiences to swallow unless they radically restructure the source material. There's also some pretty obvious issues with trying to do a full adaptation. Now, some Narnia fans may not want to hear this, and I do say this as someone who loved the series as a kid. But to me, it's undeniable that they have a steep drop-off in quality. The Magician's Nephew, which was published second to last, I think is actually really good, but in the chronological reading order, that comes first, leaving the last two books to be The Silver Chair and The Last Battle, both of which have their moments, but are nowhere near the heights of Dawn Treader or Wardrobe. And even before you get there, you have The Horse and His Boy, which definitely has its fans, but in the context of a TV show would probably seem really strange and jarring, focusing on a character that's so disconnected from everything else. Netflix just has a huge undertaking ahead of them if they actually want to adapt every Narnia book. I've already talked about the films, but even the BBC TV serials only tackled 3 of them and didn't include the finale, The Last Battle. Now this was probably because of budgetary restrictions, but also that book is just really hard to adapt. Dealing with Susan's fate alone would be pretty difficult in a family-friendly fantasy show. So having said all that, I think it's a lot easier to understand why the Narnia project may be having some issues. These aren't just not novels that lend themselves to adaptations well, especially in the later books. Now, that doesn't mean it's impossible. It honestly doesn't even mean that they still couldn't be great. Lord of the Rings was very convincingly called unfilmable for decades, but with Peter Jackson at the helm, they ended up being one of the best movie trilogies ever, so obviously anything is possible. But when it comes to Narnia, they're definitely facing an uphill battle, and I'm very interested to see how they go about it. Or maybe Netflix will eventually just decide to give up. But with a property as well known and beloved as Narnia, I'm sure there will always be someone out there willing to give it another shot.
Who would ever believe you were once a queen of Narnia?
You jolly well ran too, Queen Susan.
I hardly ever think of those days now.
Talk about something else.
So I was going to have a line in here about how trying to adapt Narnia well is as hard as a tough math equation, but math equations can actually be pretty fun and easy, especially with this week's sponsor, Brilliant. Brilliant helps you tackle new math, science, and computer science concepts in a really enjoyable way. Brilliant's everyday math is the one I swear by because instead of trapping you into one strict way of learning, everyday math gives you the tools you need to succeed on your own. Suddenly, the stuff that you remember having such a hard time with in the past might just become a lot more manageable and fun. I know it did for me. Brilliant leans into the fact that there's a lot of ways to solve a problem, and it lets you experiment instead of trapping you into one very rigid way of learning. So go to brilliant.org/midnight and try it for free. Oh, and also, the first 200 people to go to that link will get 20% off the annual premium subscription.
Here's a special tip for the fellas and girls who have not already joined Captain Midnight's new 1940 Flight Patrol. You'd better hurry up and join at once because there's a big adventure ahead. The thing to do now is to get started because we're going to have not only barrels of fun, but loads of free gifts and prizes too.